impressive. Thank you very much. Thank you. We've got a full house here in Rockefeller Center tonight. All of your lovely faces. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us at home. It's Friday in the age of Trump, which means it's the end of another deeply bizarre and confusing, upsetting and unnerving week with lots of weird pronouncements, lots of weird actions and tweets. The president wanted to buy Greenland. I don't know. It looks so big on the map. There's been a lot going on this week, but there's something else that's been happening away from the spotlight, away from the president, that I've been thinking about a lot. In the last 3 weeks, since the killings in El Paso, there have been at least 6 arrests of white supremacists who have allegedly been plotting or threatening violence. One who was arrested said he was thankful that Donald Trump will, quote, launch a race war. Another was talking about a plot against a Jewish community center, and the guy that they found had an arsenal that included a .40 caliber anti-tank gun. Of course, all this is, like I said, it's just in the period since a white supremacist drove himself all the way down to El Paso for the explicit purpose of committing mass murder against Hispanics in order to drive Hispanics from the country and change the demographic composition of the country, all motivated by an obsession with a non-existent invasion that the president and his allies are constantly demagoguing about. And we've seen this in the wake of El Paso. There's been a kind of wake-up call, right? I mean, people are like, what is going on here? There's increasingly calls to take white supremacist terrorism seriously in the United States. According to the Anti-Defamation League, domestic extremists, right, folks like this, killed just at least 50 people in just the last year. And that does not count what happened in El Paso. And a lot of people are making the point, you hear it a lot, right? If this were ISIS, we would view as an existential threat, right? I mean, after Al-Qaeda terrorists killed 3,000 Americans, we made complete changes into the nature of the American state and how we live our lives. I mean, 18 years after a guy tried to light his shoe on fire, right? We still take our shoes off at the airport, unless you're smart enough to get that TSA. But the comparison to jihadi terrorism makes sense, right? It also is kind of weird when you think about it for this reason. You don't actually have to look abroad to some foreign analog, some terrorist entity like ISIS, for the threat of American white supremacists seeking to use violence to impose a white ethno-state in America, right? That's an American tradition. In fact, it's not just an American tradition, it's really the sort of inception of what terrorism in America is. I mean, first there were white settlers, and they often used terror and violence to take land from indigenous peoples. But then the very first real terrorist cell in America, first terrorist organization in America, was made up of white supremacist forces of the defeated Confederacy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And they arose because they didn't like the demographic change that was happening, right? They wanted to preserve a white man's republic above all else, and so they used their weapons to terrorize free black people of the South. They slaughtered and murdered people in Memphis, Tennessee in 1866. They slaughtered and they murdered people with the backing of a local militia and sheriffs in 1866 in New Orleans. They organized the Ku Klux Klan for night raids. They shot people in the dead of night. They ransacked people's homes. They left nooses. They roughed black people up on the way to the polls. You know, there were more than 2,000 murders in the state of Kansas in the election related to the election of 1868. 2,000 murders. Mostly of black people and white Republicans, the party that was at that point invested in their enfranchisement. And all of this was done, all of it with the explicit purpose of what that individual went down to El Paso to do, what he wanted, to stem the tide of the erosion of the demographic power in American democracy for the white man. We are not taught about this history. I don't know about all of you. I was not taught this history. I went to like good public schools. I didn't learn this history. But at the time, it was the #1 issue in the country. When Andrew Johnson was president at the time and sort of tacitly wink, wink, nudge, nudging all this violence, he would go around to speak. And the crowds would heckle him. They would say, what about New Orleans? What about Memphis? What about the white terrorism in the South that you're doing nothing about? And when Johnson was succeeded by Ulysses S. Grant, the Republicans had to pass 3 separate pieces of legislation to enforce the law against white terrorists in the South. They actually called them the Enforcement Acts. Like, no, seriously, we mean it. And the third Enforcement Act was called the Ku Klux Klan Act. It's the first anti-terrorism legislation in the country. It allows the president to suspend habeas corpus throughout the South. It was so dramatic because they were at their wits' ends about what to do about white supremacist terroristic violence. And to the credit of the Grant administration under the aegis of the newly created Department of Justice 1 year earlier, they did something they hadn't done before. They start going in the South and they start prosecuting federal crimes against the Klan. The white terrorists of the South who were killing and burning and murdering and looting and intimidating, they start prosecuting them in federal court. And the reason they do that is because local courts won't arrest them, won't prosecute them, and local white juries will not convict them. And 2 things happened. One is they won that battle. They stamped out the Klan for a few decades. And the second is they lost the war. Because the enforcement of anti-terrorism laws against white supremacists in the South ebbed when federal troops were taken out. And when they were removed, the violence came back. And this time, the white supremacist violence throughout the South that extends all the way into the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, the lynching, the atrocities we all know, it worked. It was effective. The white terrorist violence in the South, the white nationalist terrorism, it accomplished the aim that the shooter in El Paso explicitly said that he wanted. It preserved the political power of white people for decades to come. And that is why white terrorism and white supremacist terrorism in this country is not some weird analog to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's not some foreign thing that looks like something that we've been fighting in the war on terror. It's actually fundamentally as American as anything. And it is an existential threat to the multiracial and pluralistic, equal, and open democracy that we've been fighting for in this country since people died on the battlefield in the Civil War. And here's the thing, right now, these folks, it's unnerving to think about this, but they are organized. Organized, coordinated attempts to use violence and intimidation again. The guy who was arrested in Ohio this week for threatening to shoot up a Jewish community center, as best as we can determine, here he is in Charlottesville. And the guy next to him, that's the guy who drove his car into a crowd of people later that day, murdering Heather Heyer. To me, the lesson of the KKK Act is that white supremacy as a force can never be eradicated permanently. But with the will of the state, violent terror can be vanquished. And our government's job, our president's job, our nation's job is to vanquish it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.